The girl was small enough that Garrett Hale almost didn't see her. She sat in the shade of his water trough, knees pulled to her chest, face buried in her arms. The only reason he noticed at all was the sound, a soft, rhythmic sobbing that cut through the stillness of the afternoon like a knife through cloth. Garrett had been crossing his yard with a saddle blanket draped over one shoulder, heading toward the barn to check on a mare that had thrown a shoe. He stopped mid-stride. The heat pressed down heavy, the kind of August heat that made the air shimmer and turned the ground to powder. Dust hung in the air where his boots had scuffed it loose. The child didn't look up. He set the blanket down slowly, careful not to startle her. She wore a faded cotton dress, once white, now the color of old bone. Her feet were bare, scratched and red from the hard earth. Dark hair fell in tangles around her face. "Hey there," Garrett said quietly. The sobbing stopped, but she didn't lift her head. He crouched down a few feet away, lowering himself to her level. His knees popped. 43 years old, and his body reminded him of it every morning. "You hurt?" She shook her head, still hidden. "You lost?" A pause, then a nod. Garrett glanced toward the road that wound past his property, a thin line of packed dirt that stretched between the scattered ranches and the town of Bitter Creek, 6 miles south. He saw no wagon, no horse, no sign of anyone else. "Where's your folks?" The girl finally looked up. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes red and swollen. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. When she spoke, her voice was so small he had to lean in to hear it. "I found Mama's shoes," she whispered. Garrett frowned. "What?" "I found Mama's shoes." Her chin trembled. "But not Mama." A chill ran through him despite the heat. The girl reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small, clutched tight in her fist. She opened her hand slowly, as if the act itself caused pain. In her palm lay a single button, carved bone, with a thread still looped through one of the holes, the kind sewn onto a woman's Sunday dress. "She was wearing her blue dress," the girl said, her voice breaking. "The one with the buttons. I found this one on the ground, and her shoes. But she wasn't there." Garrett's throat tightened. He'd seen plenty in his year's range wars, accidents, men dying from snake bite or bad water, but the way this child looked at him, her eyes wide and desperate, searching his face for some kind of answer that cut deeper than most things did. "Where'd you find them?" he asked gently. "By the canyon." She pointed northeast, toward the ridge that rose in the distance, jagged and red against the pale sky. "Mama said we'd camp there. She said it was safe, but when I woke up, she was gone." Garrett's mind turned over the possibilities. A woman traveling alone with a child. Camping in the open, it was dangerous, but not unheard of. People moved through this territory all the time, heading west or fleeing something east. Most kept to themselves. "What's your name?" "Clara." "Clara, I'm Garrett. How long ago did your mama go missing?" The girl's face crumpled. "I don't know. I woke up and it was still dark. I waited and waited. Then the sun came up, and she still wasn't back. I walked and found her shoes by the rocks. She started crying again, harder this time. I called for her. I called and called, but she didn't answer." Garrett stood and turned toward the house. His wife, Caroline, had died 3 winters back from fever. The place had been quiet since. Too quiet. Now this girl sat in his yard with a button and a story that made his gut twist. He looked back at Clara. "You got any other family? Someone I can take you to?" She shook her head. "Just Mama." "Where were you headed?" "California. Mama said there was work there. She said we'd find a place." Garrett exhaled slowly. California. Hundreds of miles still to go. A woman and a child. Alone. He didn't need to ask what had driven them out here. Hard times had a way of pushing people into desperate choices. He crouched down again. "You eaten today?" Clara shook her head. "Come on then. Let's get you some food. Then we'll figure this out." She hesitated, clutching the button tighter. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Garrett said. "And if your mama's out there, we'll find her. But you need to eat first. Can't do much on an empty stomach." After a long moment, Clara nodded. She stood slowly, her legs shaky, and followed him toward the house. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from that morning. Garrett motioned for her to sit at the small wooden table while he cut thick slices of bread and spread them with butter. He poured her a cup of milk from the icebox and set it down in front of her. She ate like she hadn't seen food in days. Maybe she hadn't. While she ate, Garrett stepped to the window and looked out toward the canyon ridge. It was a hard piece of country, full of rattlesnakes and drop-offs and places where a person could disappear without a trace. He'd lost cattle out there before, found their bones months later, scattered by coyotes, but a woman's shoes and a button. That wasn't coyotes. When Clara finished eating, she looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Will you help me find her?" Garrett didn't answer right away. He thought about the work waiting for him, the fence that needed mending, the mare with the thrown shoe. He thought about the smart thing to do, ride into town, hand the girl over to the marshal, let someone else deal with it. But then he thought about Caroline, about how she used to say that a person's character wasn't what they did when it was easy. It was what they did when it cost them something. He pulled his hat from the peg by the door. "Yeah," he said, "we'll find her." Garrett saddled his roan gelding while Clara stood in the barn doorway, clutching the button like a talisman. The horse stamped and shifted, sensing something off in the air. Animals always knew. "You ever ridden a horse?" Garrett asked. Clara shook her head. "Well, you're about to learn." He lifted her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her. She felt impossibly small against him, her back barely reaching his chest. He wrapped one arm loosely around her to keep her steady and took the reins with the other. They rode northeast, toward the canyon. The land opened up as they left the ranch behind rolling scrub and patches of dried grass, broken by clusters of mesquite and the occasional stunted juniper. The sun had begun its slow descent, but the heat hadn't eased. Sweat dampened Garrett's shirt between his shoulder blades. Clara pointed. "There, that's where we camped." Garrett guided the horse toward a shallow depression near the base of the ridge. As they got closer, he could see the remnants of a small fire, long since cold. A threadbare blanket lay crumpled near the ashes, a tin cup on its side. He dismounted and helped Clara down. She ran toward the blanket, then stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on something ahead. "There," she whispered. Garrett followed her line of sight. A pair of women's shoes sat neatly side by side on a flat rock, about 20 yards from the campsite. Brown leather, worn at the heels. The laces were still tied. He walked over slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Clara stayed behind him, too afraid to get closer. Garrett crouched and examined the shoes without touching them. No blood, no sign of a struggle. They looked like someone had simply stepped out of them and walked away. But people didn't do that. Not out here, not in country like this. He stood and scanned the surrounding area. The ground was hard-packed, difficult to read, but he could make out faint impressions leading away from the shoes, bare footprints, small and light. A woman's. They led toward the canyon. Garrett turned back to Clara. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "She walked that way," he said, pointing. "Why would she leave her shoes?" That was the question, wasn't it? Garrett didn't have an answer, but the knot in his gut tightened. He walked back to the campsite and searched the area more carefully. The blanket, the fire, the cup, everything suggested a woman and child traveling light, carrying only what they could manage. But there was something else, a faint smell in the air, sharp and acrid. Not smoke, something chemical. Chloroform. Garrett's jaw clenched. He'd smelled it before. Years ago. When a crooked gambler tried to rob a man in a saloon by soaking a rag and holding it over his face. The man woke up hours later with nothing but a headache and empty pockets. "But out here? In the middle of nowhere?" "Clara," Garrett said quietly, "did your mama mention seeing anyone yesterday? Any riders? Anyone passing through?" The girl thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There was a man. He came by the fire in the evening. He asked if we needed help. Mama said no, we were fine. He smiled and rode off. What he looked like? Tall. He had a black hat. And a scar." She touched her own cheek. "Here." Garrett's blood went cold. He knew that scar, knew the man who wore it. Cyrus Doane, a drifter, a scavenger, a man who lived on the edges of the law and occasionally crossed it when no one was looking. Garrett had seen him in Bitter Creek a few times over the years, always moving, always watching, always smiling, that easy smile that never reached his eyes. And now Clara's mother was gone, her shoes left behind like a discarded thought. Garrett stood and walked to his horse. He pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard and checked the load. 6 rounds. It would have to be enough. Clara's voice was small. "Is Mama hurt?" He turned to her, weighing his words. He could lie. Tell her everything would be fine. But lies had a way of breaking a person worse than the truth ever did. "I don't know," he said. "But we're gonna find out. Can I come?" "No. It's too dangerous." Her face crumpled, but she didn't cry. Just nodded. Garrett led the horse back toward the ranch at a steady walk, Clara silent behind him. When they reached the house, he brought her inside and sat her down at the table. "I need you to stay here," he said. "Lock the door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone except me. Understand? What if Mama comes back? Then you let her in, but no one else." Clara nodded, her small hands folded in her lap. Garrett grabbed a canteen, a box of matches, and an extra revolver from the drawer in his bedroom. He checked the cylinder loaded and tucked it into his belt. When he came back to the kitchen, Clara was still sitting at the table, staring at the button in her hand. "Mr. Garrett? Yeah? Do you think she's alive?" He wanted to say yes, wanted to give her that comfort, but the shoes, the smell, the man with the scar, it all pointed to something dark. "I think," Garrett said slowly, "that your mama's a fighter, and if she's out there, I'm going to bring her home." Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for the lie. But she didn't find one. "Thank you," she whispered. Garrett nodded once, then turned and walked out the door. He heard the lock click behind him. He mounted his horse and turned toward the canyon, the rifle resting across his lap. The sun hung low now, painting the ridge in shades of red and orange. Shadows stretched long across the land. Somewhere out there, a woman was missing, and Cyrus Doane knew why. Garrett urged the horse forward, his jaw set, his mind already running through what he'd do when he found the man. It wouldn't be pretty, but it would be justice. The canyon opened like a wound in the earth. Garrett followed the rim for half a mile before he found a trail that led down narrow, treacherous, carved by runoff and time. His horse picked its way carefully, hooves sliding on loose stone. The walls rose on either side, rust-red and ancient, striped with layers of sediment that told stories older than memory. At the bottom, the air was cooler. Shadows pooled thick and heavy. The sound of his horse's breathing echoed faintly off the rock. He dismounted and led the animal forward on foot, eyes scanning the ground. The bare footprints were easier to follow here, pressed into the softer sand that collected in the low places. They wandered, uncertain, as if the person making them had been disoriented or drugged. Garrett's grip tightened on the rifle. The prints led deeper into the canyon, following a dry creek bed that wound between the walls like a scar. He moved slowly, listening. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the rocks and the occasional skitter of a lizard. Then he heard something else. Voices. He froze. They came from ahead, around a bend in the canyon. Low and rough, too far to make out words, but close enough to know they were real. Garrett tied the horse to a scraggly juniper and continued on foot, keeping to the shadows along the wall. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, the metal warm from the sun. He edged around the bend, slow and careful, and saw them. Two men stood near a small fire built against the base of the canyon wall. One was tall, lean, with a black hat and a face Garrett recognized even from a distance. Cyrus Doane. The other was shorter, thick-shouldered, with a beard that covered half his face. Between them, slumped against a rock, was a woman. Her dress was blue, torn at the shoulder. Her feet were bare, cut and bleeding. Her head lolled forward, dark hair falling across her face. Garrett's heart hammered. She was alive. Doane laughed at something the other man said, his voice carrying on the still air. "She'll fetch a good price in Santa Fe. They're always looking for workers. Don't matter if she agrees or not." The bearded man grunted. "What about the kid? Left her at the camp. Someone'll find her. Or they won't." Doane shrugged. "Ain't our problem." Rage surged through Garrett, hot and blinding. He raised the rifle and stepped out from the shadows. "It's your problem now." Both men spun toward him, hands dropping to their guns. "Don't," Garrett said, his voice flat and cold. The rifle was aimed squarely at Doane's chest. "You even twitch and I'll put a hole through you." Doane's eyes narrowed, but his hand stopped halfway to his holster. He smiled slowly, the scar on his cheek pulling tight. "Well now, Garrett Hale. Didn't expect to see you out here. Funny how things work out." The bearded man shifted his weight. Garrett swung the rifle toward him. "You too. Hands where I can see them." Both men raised their hands slowly, palms out. Garrett stepped closer, keeping the rifle trained on them. His eyes flicked to the woman. She was breathing, but her eyes were closed, her body slack. "What you give her?" he demanded. Doane tilted his head. "Just a little something to keep her quiet. She'll be fine. Well, maybe not fine, but alive. Kick your guns away, both of you." Doane hesitated. The bearded man glanced at him, uncertain. "Do it," Garrett said, "or I start shooting." Doane smirked, but he drew his revolver slowly with 2 fingers and tossed it aside. The bearded man followed suit. The guns landed in the dirt a few feet away. "Now step back." They did. Garrett moved to the woman, keeping the rifle trained on the men with one hand while he crouched beside her with the other. He touched her shoulder gently. "Ma'am?" Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. She tried to speak, but the sound came out slurred and broken. "It's okay," Garrett said quietly. "I'm here to help. Your daughter sent me." At the mention of Clara, the woman's eyes widened. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. "Easy," Garrett said. "Just stay still." Doan laughed. "You really think you're going to walk out of here with her, old man? There's 2 of us. One of you. You can't watch us both forever." "Don't need forever," Garrett said. "Just need long enough to put a bullet in you if you move." The bearded man shifted again, his eyes darting toward his gun in the dirt. Garrett saw it, saw the calculation happening behind the man's eyes. "Don't," Garrett warned. But the man lunged. Garrett fired. The shot cracked through the canyon like thunder. The bearded man jerked backward and hit the ground hard, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. Doan's hand shot toward his belt, toward a knife Garrett hadn't seen. Garrett swung the rifle toward him and fired again. The bullet struck Doan in the leg. He went down with a shout, his hand clutching his thigh, the knife falling from his grip. "Next one goes through your skull," Garrett said, his voice shaking with fury. "Move again and see what happens." Doan glared at him, teeth bared in pain, but he didn't move. The canyon fell silent except for the groans of the 2 men and the ragged sound of Garrett's breathing. Smoke curled from the barrel of the rifle. He turned back to the woman. She was staring at him now, her eyes clearer, tears streaming down her face. "Clara," she whispered. "She's safe," Garrett said. "She's at my ranch, waiting for you." The woman closed her eyes and sobbed deep, shuddering sobs that shook her whole body. Garrett stood and backed toward his horse, the rifle still trained on Doan. "If either of you follows me, I'll kill you. That's a promise." Doan spat blood. "You're a dead man, Hale." Garrett didn't answer. He just turned, scooped the woman into his arms, and carried her toward the horse. Behind him, Doan's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "You hear me? Dead." But Garrett was already gone. The ride back to the ranch took longer than it should have. Garrett went slow. The woman cradled in front of him, her weight slumped against his chest. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring Clara's name like a prayer. He kept one arm around her, the other guiding the horse, the rifle slung awkwardly across his back. The sun had set by the time the ranch came into view, the sky above fading from orange to deep purple. Lamplight glowed in the kitchen window. Clara had lit it while she waited. Garrett dismounted carefully and carried the woman to the house. He kicked the door lightly with his boot. "Clara, it's me. Open up." The lock clicked. The door swung open. Clara stood there, her face pale in the dim light. When she saw her mother, she let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "Mama." Garrett carried the woman inside and laid her gently on the old couch near the fireplace. Clara climbed up beside her, wrapping her small arms around her mother's neck, tears streaming down her face. The woman's eyes opened. She saw Clara and started crying again, pulling her daughter close, whispering things Garrett couldn't hear, things he wasn't meant to. He stepped back and gave them space. In the kitchen, he lit the stove and set a kettle on to boil. His hands shook slightly as he worked, adrenaline still coursing through him, the echo of gunshots ringing in his ears. He flexed his fingers, trying to steady them. When the water was hot, he made coffee and poured 2 cups. He carried one to the couch and set it on the small table beside the woman. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you need to drink something. Help clear your head." She looked up at him, her face bruised and streaked with dirt, her eyes still glassy. But there was something else there now, clarity beginning to return. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, raw. "You saved my life." Garrett shook his head. "Your daughter did that. She found me, told me what happened." The woman looked at Clara, smoothing the girl's tangled hair with a trembling hand. "My brave girl." Clara buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Garrett pulled a chair from the table and sat down a few feet away, giving them room but staying close in case they needed anything. He sipped his coffee and watched the fire he'd built in the hearth, the flames casting shifting shadows on the walls. After a while, the woman spoke again. "I'm Mary Brennan. Garrett Hale." "I know," she said. "Clara told me." She paused, her eyes distant. "I thought I was dead. When I woke up in that canyon, I couldn't move, couldn't think. I heard them talking about selling me, like I was cattle. Garrett's jaw tightened. They won't hurt anyone else. Did you? I shot them. Don't know if they'll live or die. Don't much care either. Mary nodded slowly, as if that answer made perfect sense. Maybe it did. We were trying to get to California, she said after a moment. My husband died last year. Fever. We lost the farm after that, couldn't keep up with the payments. I thought if we went west, we could start over. Find work. Build something. She laughed bitterly. Stupid, right? No, Garrett said, hopeful. There's a difference. Mary looked at him, her eyes searching his face. You live out here alone? My wife passed a few years back. I'm sorry. Garrett shrugged. Life's hard. For everyone. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and Clara's soft breathing as she drifted off to sleep against her mother's side. Mary stroked her daughter's hair absently, her gaze distant. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't come. If you'd just ignored her. Couldn't do that. A lot of people would have. Garrett didn't answer. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. He didn't think much about what other people would do. He just knew what felt right. You can stay here tonight, he said. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. Mary's eyes filled with tears again. We don't have any money. I can't pay you. Don't want your money. Then what do you want? Garrett thought about that. What did he want? The honest answer was that he didn't know anymore. He'd been drifting through his days since Caroline died, working the ranch because it was what he knew how to do, not because it meant anything. But tonight, sitting here with this woman and her daughter, two people who had no reason to trust him but did anyway, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. I don't want anything, he said finally. Just do right by your girl. That's enough. Mary nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I will. Garrett stood and walked to the kitchen. He returned with a blanket and draped it over Clara, who was now fully asleep. Mary pulled it up around her shoulders, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's back. Get some rest, Garrett said. I'll be in the next room if you need anything. Mary looked up at him, her expression soft. Thank you, Mr. Hale. He nodded once and turned toward the hallway. Mr. Hale? He stopped and looked back. Why'd you do it? Mary asked. Really? You didn't know us, didn't owe us anything. Garrett was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, My wife used to say that the world's only as good as the people in it. If we all just walked past each other's suffering, there wouldn't be much left worth saving. Mary smiled faintly. She sounds like she was a good woman. She was. Garrett walked to his room and closed the door behind him. He sat on the edge of his bed, the rifle resting against the wall, and stared out the window at the dark land beyond. Tomorrow would bring new problems. Doane and his partner might come looking for revenge. The marshal might ask questions. Mary and Clara would need help getting back on their feet. But tonight, they were safe. And that was enough. Morning came slow and golden. Garrett woke to the smell of coffee, not his own, but someone else's. He dressed quickly and walked to the kitchen, where he found Mary standing at the stove, Clara beside her, both of them looking more alive than they had the night before. Mary turned when she heard him. I hope you don't mind. I found the coffee and thought I'd make some. Don't mind at all, Garrett said. She poured him a cup and handed it to him. Her hands were steadier now, the glassiness gone from her eyes. The bruise on her face had darkened overnight, but her expression was clear. How you feeling? Garrett asked. Sore, but better. She glanced at Clara. We both are. Clara smiled shyly at him. She was holding a piece of bread with butter, eating slowly. They sat at the table together, the three of them, and for a while no one spoke. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that came when words weren't necessary. Finally, Mary said, I've been thinking about what comes next. Garrett waited. We can't go to California, she continued. Not now. We don't have supplies, no wagon, and after what happened. She trailed off, shaking her head. I can't risk Clara like that again. What will you do? I was hoping. She hesitated, then met his eyes. I was hoping maybe we could stay here. For a little while, just until I can figure something out. I can work, I'm good with animals, and I can cook, clean, mend. I won't be a burden. Garrett considered that. The ranch was more than one man could handle, especially as he got older. He'd been putting off repairs, letting things slide. An extra pair of hands would help, but it was more than that. The house had been too quiet for too long, too empty. "You can stay," he said. "Long as you need." Mary's face crumpled with relief. "Thank you. Truly." Clara looked up at him with wide eyes. "Can I help with the horses?" Garrett smiled. "I expect you can." Later that morning, Garrett rode into Bitter Creek to speak with the marshal. He found him in his office, a small room attached to the general store, papers stacked haphazardly on a desk that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Marshal Pruitt was a gray-haired man with a tired face and a belly that strained against his vest. He looked up when Garrett walked in. "Hale, what brings you to town?" Garrett told him. "All of it. The girl, the shoes, the canyon, Donnie." Pruitt listened without interrupting. When Garrett finished, the marshal leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Cyrus Doane. Should have known." He rubbed his face with one hand. "I'll send someone out to the canyon. If they're still there, we'll bring them in. If not," he shrugged, "well, maybe that's justice enough. And the woman and her daughter, what about them?" "They're staying with me, for now." Pruitt raised an eyebrow. "That right?" "That's right." The marshal studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Keep me informed if anything changes." Garrett stood to leave, then paused. "Pruitt?" "Yeah?" Doane said something about selling her in Santa Fe. Pruitt's expression darkened. "There's rumors, people disappearing along the trails. Women, mostly. No one's been able to prove anything, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I'll look into it." Garrett nodded and walked out. When he returned to the ranch, he found Mary and Clara in the barn. Mary was brushing down the roan while Clara sat on a bale of hay, watching intently. "He likes you," Garrett said. Mary smiled. "Horses always did." Over the following weeks, a rhythm developed. Mary cooked, cleaned, and tended the animals. Clara followed Garrett everywhere, asking endless questions about the ranch, the horses, the land. He answered patiently, surprised by how much he enjoyed her curiosity. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. Mary would tell stories, some true, some half-invented, and Clara would listen, wide-eyed, until she fell asleep in her mother's lap. One night, after Clara had gone to bed, Mary turned to Garrett. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that I'm grateful for everything. But I also want you to know that we're not here to take advantage. When I've saved enough, we'll move on, find our own place." Garrett looked at her. "And if I don't want you to move on?" Mary blinked. "What?" "This place is big," Garrett said. "Too big for one person. Could use someone to share the load. And Clara," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "She reminds me what it's like to have life in a house again." Mary's eyes glistened. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't have to leave unless you want to." She looked away, wiping at her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it." She nodded. "I'll think about it." But Garrett already knew the answer. 3 years later, Clara ran through the yard, chasing a barn cat that had stolen a piece of jerky from the kitchen. Her laughter echoed off the barn walls, bright and unguarded. Mary stood in the doorway, shaking her head with a smile. She wore a simple dress, faded from sun and work, but her face was full and content in a way it hadn't been when she first arrived. Garrett walked up beside her, his hat in his hand, his shirt dusty from fixing a stretch of fence. "She's getting fast." "She's getting wild," Mary said, but there was no reproach in her voice. Garrett smiled. "Good." Mary glanced at him. "You think she'll remember? What happened back then?" "Maybe, maybe not," he shrugged. "Either way, she's safe now. That's what matters." Mary reached out and took his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the years, though neither of them spoke much about it. "Thank you," she said, "for giving us a home." Garrett squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for making it one." They stood there together, watching Clara chase the cat into the barn, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. The canyon was far behind them now. The shoes, the button, the fear, all of it faded like a bad dream. What remained was this: laughter, safety, and the quiet promise of tomorrow. And in the end, that was all anyone really needed.